I hope to show that a lack of shared values between the English middle and working class lie at the heart of its ultimate demise. Of course, many people feel that my talking about the demise of England and the English is a little premature. I'm sure that in 200, or even perhaps 1,000 years' time, there will be a place called England, and even people who are called English. However, the future holds a break with the past, a disconnection with the values and even the genetic line of England. England is not alone in this fate, and Western Europe too will be changed dramatically. We've always been influenced for the better, and quite often for the worse, by our European neighbours. So who are the English? Let's start with the English before England. The cultural and a part of the genetic roots of the English go further back than a country called England. The Angle or Engle tribe dominated lowland Britain so much in the 6th and 7th century that it would forever bear their name, Angleland, England. The Angles had their origin across the North Sea. They are a Germanic people. They inhabited lands that are now part of Denmark and northern Germany. However, this is not where the story starts. As late as the early 2000s, there were people who held to the theory that those terrible English landed a couple of 100,000 men in Celtic Britain. The scoundrels then proceeded to wipe out the Celtic male line and take their women. Dr. Thomas of King's College London espoused this theory with vigour. The truth is more likely that the genetic makeup of the white British has hardly changed since the last Ice Age. Hard to believe when we consider the invasions of Romans, Vikings and Normans. However, let's look at the facts in more detail. David Marrs thought that approximately 80% of British genes come from hunter-gatherers who came in immediately after the last Ice Age. Marrs built his conclusions on the large-scale genetic investigation undertaken by Stephen Hoppenheimer in 2006. Perhaps as little as 10,000 to 25,000 Anglo-Saxons actually migrated to Britain. During the last Ice Age, a group of people with the genetic Pacific marker R1b was stranded in northern Spain. As the ice retreated, it was these people who recolonised Western Europe. Of course, there were later invasions, some peaceful, some not so peaceful. But no single event contributed more than 5% to the British gene pool. As my genes indicate a northern German origin, I feel a little excluded. It's interesting that the British government was happy to ratify the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, but added that it considered there was no indigenous population in Britain. Not that surprising when we consider that this is the same governmental institution that through immigration, mostly from the Third World, has changed the genetic map of Britain, and in particular England, more in the last 30 years than it had been changed in the previous 10,000. Another question is, where does this leave those who are so proud of the differences between the British nations, the Celtic Anglo-Saxon divide? Well, of course, there's nature-nurture, and there are definite cultural differences between the regions of Britain. The history between the nations has left its legacy too, though I would argue that those cultural differences are not as great as they would first appear. We are all influenced by history, and I wonder if the Scottish tennis ace would have been so quick to voice his hope that anyone but England should win the World Cup, if history had been different and the Scots had dominated this island. Even after Murray's insult to their people, the middle-class English still cheer Murray at Wimbledon, whilst eating their overpriced strawberries. Even though this piece is about the English, it's worth a mention of our Scottish neighbours. Scotland, that bastion of Celtic culture with traditions that extend to the beginnings of time, is in reality the youngest of the three nations that make up mainland Britain. It was formed towards the end of the Dark Ages from 5 cultural groups who spoke at least 4 different languages. The mysterious and once mighty Picts, the Scots in the west complete with their Irish Gaelic, and in the Isles Vikings, the Strathclyde Welsh in the southwest, oh, and those awful Angles in the southeast. It is worth noting that the Germanic language that was to become English has been spoken longer in Edinburgh and Stirling than it has in Leeds. The kilt, associated with clan names, has a history of just over 200 years, but does so much to define a nation. Influences from even further afield than Europe have also impacted on this island. Neolithic farming was the first Middle Eastern set of ideas to impact upon us. For the first times, groups of people could settle permanently near a stable food source. No longer dependent on hunter-gathering lifestyle, they may have expected that things would have got better. Sadly, that wasn't the case. People could now produce excess food, enough of an excess to finance a non-working class of overlords and professional religious elite. Thus people managed to develop a system whereby they paid with their labour to employ their own oppressors. The agricultural revolution even made our brains get smaller. Ruff et al. 1997 found that human brain size reached its peak about 90,000 years ago, and then stayed pretty constant, until there is the wonderful agricultural revolution. Human brain size has decreased by 11% since 35,000 years ago, and most of this decrease, 8%, coming in the last 10,000 years. Since it is unlikely that there was evolutionary pressure for humans to develop smaller brains, the effect is most likely due to diet. The hunter-gatherers ate considerably more meat than their settled descendants. In fact, meat consumption probably decreased from around 50% to as little as 10% of the diet. The brain needs fatty acids to develop fully, and the easiest way to absorb them into the body is through eating meat. It is interesting to note that the brain size of all domesticated mammals appears to have decreased, with the exception of cats. But there again, are cats really domesticated? Tooth decay was rare until the agricultural revolution, and not only our brain size but also our height has dropped by some 4 to 5 inches over the last 10,000 years. The Neolithic farmers could expect to live into their 20s, while the hunter-gatherer forebears could expect to live on average to 33, even 54 if they made it to 15. However, the population grew, placing more pressure on the natural resources of the island.